Hello and welcome back, future scientists. I'm Mr. K with Mississippi Public Broadcasting, and I have another great lesson ready for y'all today. So today we're really talking about carbohydrates, which is one example of macromolecules. Okay, so let's go ahead and hop into it and see what we're talking about. So remember, carbohydrates are made up of grains or starches. If it's coming from a plant, it's probably a carbohydrate. Carbohydrates are very important because they are the fast fuel for your body. Your body mostly runs off of carbohydrates, okay? It is the first macromolecule that's going to be used to obtain energy for the body because very little energy is required to break down carbohydrates. So you have to put a little energy in to break a macromolecule down, but we're getting a lot back when we're breaking down carbohydrates. It takes a little to break it, but then we get a lot of energy out of it. Okay, so that's mostly why carbohydrates are your main source of energy for your body. Okay, so carbohydrates, some other examples of these, you'll hear people call them grains or starches. This picture has a lot of different carbohydrates in there: wheat, pasta, oats, all of those are carbohydrates. Okay, carbohydrates are basically sugar molecules. Even really complex carbohydrates like starches are just made up of sugar, okay? So the simplest carbohydrate is a monosaccharide. Remember, saccharide means sugar, mono means one, so one sugar. And sometimes you'll hear people call this a simple sugar. Some examples of this would be like glucose, okay? Monosaccharides can be covalently bonded together to create more complex sugars. So if we take a monosaccharide and fuse it together, we would use that dehydration synthesis. We could make something called a disaccharide. A disaccharide is just two simple sugars fused together, okay? Di, as in disaccharide, means two, so it's two sugar molecules, okay? But if you take a lot of monosaccharides and fuse all of them together and get up to like the hundreds or thousands of sugars, that'll make something called a polysaccharide. And this is a type of carbohydrate that is the polymer, but it's many monosaccharides all fused together. And these have a lot of energy in them. Somewhat counterintuitively, the more sugar that is in a molecule, the less sweet that it tastes. You would think that, oh, well, a starch is a bunch of sugar. A lot of sugar should taste sweet, right? Not really. So bread and pasta, rice, potatoes, a lot of those are starches or polysaccharides. There's a lot of sugar in them, but the more complex it is, the less sweet that it tastes. It's actually those really, really simple sugars like glucose that taste really sweet. Okay, but if you take bread or like a cracker and start to eat it and chew it up in your mouth, as you chew it, it will become more sweet because your body is already breaking it down into those simple sugars. So that's why when you're chewing up a carbohydrate, it'll taste sweeter as you continue to chew it. Okay, so let's talk about carbohydrates a little bit more. The basic unit here is sugar, and we talked about how they're the main source of energy, but they are also used as structural support. They're really important for plants. Plants make a type of starch called cellulose, which makes up their cell walls. And you can see there the third bullet point, fiber is a carbohydrate that prevents constipation. So that cellulose is in plant cells. If you eat fruits and vegetables, they have a lot of cellulose in their cells. Cellulose is another word for fiber, and fiber helps to keep you regular, is what people say. Now, it says here that it prevents constipation, but that's not the only thing that it does. Eating fiber is super important, okay? Over half of all Americans do not eat as much fiber as they should in a day. And in America, colon cancer is on the rise, especially for young people. So it's really important to eat your fruits and vegetables and get as much fiber in your diet as you can. But you can also just take a fiber supplement. They make those little gummies. I think they're called Metamucil. They're fiber supplements, and you can just eat those and kind of make sure you're getting enough fiber in your diet, and that'll help with some of those future health problems down the road. Okay? What are some other examples of carbohydrates? Well, you can have breads, cereals, vegetables, fruits, and seeds. All of those are examples of carbohydrates. Again, my little rule of thumb is that if it's coming from a plant, it's probably a carbohydrate. So cereal is like whole grain cereal, right? Grain is a plants, so it's a carbohydrate. Fruits, seeds, and vegetables, all very obviously coming from plants. Bread is made out of wheat. Wheat is a plant. So all of those are carbohydrates because if it's coming from a plant, it's probably a carbohydrate. Okay? Another example of using carbohydrates as a structural support is that for humans, extra glucose is converted into glycogen in the liver. So imagine one night you go and you eat a whole pizza by yourself, or maybe you eat a lot of pasta or a lot of rice. Okay, so your body wants to spend that as energy, but if you just ate a big dinner, you might not go out and exercise right afterwards. So what your body does is it takes all that glucose that you just ate from that pasta and it turns it into glycogen. You have 24 hours to burn that glycogen off and use it for energy before your body starts to convert it into fat. Okay, so if you're really trying to keep that fat off, if you eat a lot of carbs, make sure you try to burn off as much as you can in 24 hours. When it's in that glycogen state, it's easy to burn off. But once your body goes through the effort of putting it and making it as fat, it doesn't want to get rid of it. Okay, so glycogen is just a kind of intermediate in between carbohydrates and fats. It's a way to kind of store energy, not for a super long time, but for 24 hours. Okay? So here are a couple of examples of carbohydrates. On the left, I have simple cane sugar. So this is powdered sugar or sugar you might put in your cereal or oatmeal. That's all carbohydrates, and that's simple sugar. On the right, we have more grains and starches. There's bread, potatoes, sweet potatoes, there's pasta, some chickpeas, rice. All of those are complex carbohydrates. Again, that's a lot of sugars that have been fused together, and so it's got a lot of sugar in it, but it doesn't really taste sweet. But as your body starts to break it down, it'll kind of get that sweet taste as it goes. Okay, so carbohydrates. Let's look at the actual word carbohydrate a little bit. So the first part of the word is carbo. That kind of sounds like an element. What does that make you think of? Probably makes you think of carbon, right? And then that second part of the word is hydrates. What does hydrates make you think of? It makes you think of water, right? So a carbohydrate is just water that has carbon attached to it. And the reason we say that is that it has the same ratio of hydrogens and oxygens that water does. So what's the chemical equation for water? H2O. It's twice as many hydrogens as there are oxygens. And you can see here that the same thing is going on. In this example, this is glucose. We have 6 carbons, we have 6 oxygens, and we have 12 hydrogens. So we have twice as many hydrogens as we do oxygens, just like we do in a water molecule. Now, another reason I have this picture up here is that this is what you will often see carbohydrates depicted as. This is a monosaccharide. It is a simple sugar. And I know that because I only see one ring. Sugars are often depicted with this ring-like structure. So I only see one ring here, so this would be a monosaccharide. But what would we call it if you have 2 sugar molecules bonded together? Look at this picture. I've got one ring of sugar, I've got another ring of sugar. Okay, so this isn't a monosaccharide, it's a disaccharide. Di means 2. So this is 2 rings of sugar that have been fused together. Okay, this would still be a simple carbohydrate, it's just not as simple as the monosaccharide. Now let's talk about complex carbs. Okay, so let's say I take a monosaccharide like glucose and I fuse a lot of them together. What's a prefix we've been talking about that means many? Poly, right? So if I take a lot of monosaccharides and fuse them together, I'm going to make a polysaccharide. That's what this picture is of down here. I see 1, 2, 3, 4 sugars all fused together, and that's on the small side. Polysaccharides can be up to thousands or millions of carbohydrates large. So that's why they're called macromolecules, because they're really, really big. Okay? So I just kind of wanted to show you a couple of different examples of this. Okay? Let's look at the 2 pictures on the left. So again, I've got a monosaccharide. It's 1 ring of sugar. Right next to it is a disaccharide. That's 2 rings of sugar that have been fused together. So it's a disaccharide. Di means 2. Below that is a polysaccharide. I've got a lot of rings that have all been fused together, And poly means many, so this is many sugars. So that's why it's called a polysaccharide. Now take a look at my picture on the right. I have a couple of different examples of sugars. So look at monosaccharides. I have glucose, fructose, and galactose. We talked about glucose a little bit. Fructose is the sugar in fruit. So when you eat like a fruit, apples, oranges, they taste sweet. That's because they have sugar in them, and the sugar inside of them is called fructose. Here are some examples of disaccharides: maltose, sucrose, and lactose. You might have heard of lactose before. What type of food would you find lactose in? Lactose is often in milk products, right? The sugar in milk is called lactose. If you can't digest lactose, you're lactose intolerant. And we'll talk about why that is here shortly. Okay, let's look at some examples of polysaccharides. You have starch, you have glycogen, and you have cellulose. And we talked about a couple of these already. Starches are things like potatoes and breads. Okay, cellulose is the stuff inside of cell walls for plants. And then lastly, glycogen is how your body stores energy for about 24 hours before you burn it off. Now, before I go to the next slide, I want us to take another look at the names of some of these sugars and see if we can find a similarity in between all of them. Okay, so we've got glucose, fructose, galactose, maltose, sucrose, lactose, cellulose. Any similarities in between them? They all end the same way. They all end in OSE. Okay, that's very, very important. Carbohydrates, sugars almost always end in OSE. So here's what I want you to do for homework. Go home, take anything out of the pantry or the fridge, and look at the nutritional facts on the back. You might not see something like sugar listed, but I can guarantee you that you'll see a word that ends in OSE. They kind of try to trick you sometimes. They're saying, oh, there's no sugar in this food, there's just glucose. Oh, there's no sugar in this food, there's just fructose. So that's what they'll do sometimes, but if you see a word that ends in OSE, it's sugar, okay? All right, so I just got a couple of review questions. We're going to go over them together, and then your teacher is going to pass out a worksheet. It's got maybe 10 questions on it, some review stuff that we've been talking about today, and I just want to see what y'all remember. So I'm going to ask a question. Why don't y'all yell it out, and then that way your classmates will know that you've been paying attention and how smart you are. So let's see what y'all remember. So first of all, these are carbohydrates. What are the elements that make up carbohydrates? The stuff off the periodic table that we talked about. So carbohydrates are made up of C, H, and O. They're made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And bonus points if you mention the 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. What I really want you to remember here is just the word CHO. CHO, okay? Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, CHO. That's what makes up carbohydrates, okay? What is the monomer of a carbohydrate called? What is the monomer of a carbohydrate called? Kind of sounds like the word monomer a little bit. These are called monosaccharides. Monosaccharides is the monomer of carbohydrates. They have the same prefix because that means one. And some examples of monosaccharides are here. You have fructose, glucose, and galactose. Okay, those are all simple sugars. Okay, what is the function of carbohydrates? It's the first form of what for the body? It's mostly used for energy, okay? It's the main source of quick energy for living things. But also carbohydrates are used for energy storage, okay? We talked about glycogen for humans and cellulose and starches for plants, okay? You can see here in animals, glycogen is stored in the liver, and in plants, starches are stored in the roots, okay? Carbohydrates can also be used for a structural purpose. So an example of this would be to build cell walls. So cellulose is very important. It makes up the cell walls in plants. That cellulose is also known as fiber. It helps keep you regular. Some other types of organisms use carbohydrates to make this stuff called chitin. So like if you've ever seen a mushroom or any type of fungus, it kind of looks like a plant. It's really not a plant, but it kind of looks like it sometimes. Well, the same way that plants use cellulose in the cell walls, fungi use chitin in the cell walls. But also chitin is used by invertebrates. So you know how insects have that exoskeleton. If you squash a bug, you can kind of tell it's hard on the outside. You know, those invertebrates, they don't have any skeletons, but the outside, they've got an exoskeleton that's very hard. Well, the exoskeleton is made up of chitin, and chitin is also a type of carbohydrate. Okay? Great. Y'all, so I know y'all probably knocked that out. Here's what I want you to do now. Teacher, go ahead and pass out those worksheets for me. This is just like 8 quick questions. Pass them out. Y'all work on them. Maybe team up with a partner. Take 5 or 10 minutes. It's just 1 page on the front. And then when y'all are ready, you can come back up here and I'll review it when we're ready. So go ahead and pause the video, work on it for a couple minutes, and then come back to me when you're done. All right, I know that this was no problem for y'all, right? Let's go ahead and review it just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. Anything you don't have, go ahead and add for me, and you know, feel free to change anything to make sure it's matching what I'm doing up here. So let's go ahead and get started. Number 1 says, which elements do carbohydrates contain and in what ratio? What word do we really want to remember here? We really want to remember the word CHO, okay? CHO, C-H-O, because carbohydrates are mostly made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. What's the ratio? It's 1 to 2 to 1. What this means is that there's always twice as many hydrogens as there are carbons or oxygens, and that's very similar to water. Water has twice as many hydrogens as it does oxygens, okay? So number 2 is asking what do these prefixes mean, and then what type of examples are those sugars? Okay, so first of all, monosaccharide, what does mono mean? Mono means 1, okay? A disaccharide, what does di mean? Di means 2. And then poly, what does poly mean? Poly means many. So what we're doing here is we're just going to count the rings of sugar. If we see 1 ring, it's going to be a monosaccharide. If we see 2 rings, it's going to be a disaccharide. If we see more than 2, it's going to be a polysaccharide, right? So fructose is a type of monosaccharide. I'll just write the prefix out here because I can't fit that whole saccharide part up here, okay? So fructose is a monosaccharide. How'd I know that? Because there is 1 ring of sugar here. Okay, ribose. What type of carbohydrate is ribose? It's also a monosaccharide. Okay, how'd I know that? It's 1 ring of sugar. Okay, the next one is talking about cellulose. Okay, what type of carbohydrate is cellulose? It's a polysaccharide. And I know that because I see a lot of different rings all fused together. Again, cellulose is the starch inside of cell walls. It's also known as fiber sometimes. Okay? The next one, letter D, is asking about glucose. What type of sugar is glucose? It's a monosaccharide. It's probably the most important example of a monosaccharide. Your body mostly runs off of glucose. All right? The next one here is sucrose. What type of sugar is sucrose? Well, it's 2 rings of sugar, so that's a disaccharide. Okay. How about the next one? Deoxyribose. What type of sugar is deoxyribose? Well, it's only 1 sugar ring, so I'm going to write mono. This is a monosaccharide. And then the last one, a starch. I see a lot of different rings all fused together here, so this is going to be a polysaccharide. Okay? Great job. That's the first half of the worksheet. Go ahead, take a second, mark all that up, and here in just a minute, I'll switch over to the bottom half, okay? All right, everybody ready to go? Maybe pause the video if you need to. All right, let's check the bottom half of that real quick. Y'all are doing really great. Thanks for hanging in there with me. Macromolecules can be kind of tough sometimes, but it's really, really interesting once you know what you're talking about. And anybody who's interested in building muscle or losing weight or staying healthy, a really important part of that is knowing about macromolecules. So let's go ahead and hop into this. Number 3 says, describe a biological function for each of the following carbohydrates. Okay, so cellulose, I just mentioned this earlier. Does anyone remember what cellulose is used for? Well, we're going to find this in cell walls, okay, of plants. That's how plants, they don't have skeletons, so that's how they stay upright, is by using a cell wall. Another thing you could put here is that cellulose is fiber, which we kind of talked about helps keep us regular, right? Really important. Okay, okay, so what about a biological function for starch? Well, starch is more of, carbohydrates as a whole is short-term energy, but starch is a little bit of a longer-term energy. So I'll put long-term energy here. I think that's fine. It's not as long-term as like fat is. Fat is the really long-term one, but starches are kind of long-term. Okay, and then the last one, glucose. What is glucose used for? This is the short-term energy. Okay. Your body will pretty much immediately start using any glucose you eat and start using it for energy. Okay, is the following molecule monosaccharide, disaccharide, or polysaccharide? I see 2 rings of sugar, so this is going to be a disaccharide. Perfect. All right, couple more. Number 5, what is a synthesis reaction? What does synthesis mean? Does anyone remember what synthesis means? It means to make something. So in a synthesis reaction, we're making something. I think something else we could put here is that we're building something larger. If you're synthesizing something, you're either making it or you're making something larger. So I'll put making polymers. Okay, great. 6, what happens during digestion of polysaccharides? I kind of talked about this earlier. Remember that polysaccharides, it's a lot of sugar, but they don't really taste sweet all the time. Bread and pasta, potatoes, I wouldn't really say they taste sweet. But if you take bread or a cracker and chew it up a little bit and leave it in your mouth, it will become more sweet. And that's because your body is breaking it down. It's breaking it from polysaccharides into monosaccharides, and that's where that sweet taste is coming from. So what happens during digestion of polysaccharides? Well, we turn them into monosaccharides. Okay? The polysaccharides are long-term energy, but your body mostly wants monosaccharides to burn them off. Kind of imagine having like $1 million bill. That $1 million bill is awesome and you're rich, but it's not like you can really use it if you went to the store or went to go buy something, they're not going to take $1 million bill. So what you want to do is break it down into a form that you can use. So maybe instead of $1 million bill, you have a bunch of 20s. Anybody's going to take a 20. That's kind of what's going on here. The polysaccharide is like that $1 million bill, but we really need to break it into a smaller form that your body can use, and those are monosaccharides. Those are the simple sugars. Okay, next up, number 7. What is the name of the reaction used to build polymers? So think back to last unit. There's 2 reactions that we talked about. One builds them up and one makes them smaller. Which one builds up the polymers? That's the dehydration synthesis, okay? Dehydration synthesis is going to build up. It's how you take small things and make them bigger. Okay, and then the last one. What is the name of the reaction used to break polymers? Is there a suffix we've been talking about that means to break? Y'all might remember that lysis means to break. Okay? And what do we use to break down polymers? We use water. So let's go with hydro. Okay, so hydrolysis is the equation, the chemical reaction used to break down polymers. Dehydration builds them up, hydrolysis breaks them down. Y'all, thank you so much for hanging in there with me. Y'all are so smart. There's a couple more assignments we want y'all to work on, so make sure to give it your best effort, and I hope everybody has a great day.